Today we'll be talking about something that's likely to spark up just a little bit of drama within the comment section of my small budding channel. I'm referring to some of the ideas that Wizards of the Coast is trying to add to Dungeons & Dragons now, and essentially try to bring the game into the 21st century. These are ideas that attempt to make the game more diverse and more inclusive by making changes to a core concept within the game, and that's the concept of race, which we'll be discussing today. Since the summer of 2020, WOTC's been slowly playing with the idea, first with the introduction of Origin Management and Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and then with recent Unearthed Arcana featuring lineages. These alternative approaches to race give players more options in character creation by divorcing stat bonuses from genetic heritage. This has stirred up some controversy among veteran players who see this as pandering to PC culture. Rather than just calling these people out, I wanted to examine the origins of race in D&D and talk about why these changes are important and why they may be the future of the game. Because racism isn't just a character trait. The world is filled with innumerable powerful cultural influences that drive us to infer things about people based purely off of something as arbitrary as their appearance or where they're from. I'm of course not implying that racism isn't real, far from it, nor that it doesn't still carry dire and deadly consequences for those marginalized by it. I'm just underlining the fact that its power is institutional. It's derived from systems, media, and culture that reinforce and perpetuate the racism that oppresses so many. Furthermore, I believe that rather than stop the conversation at accusations as to whether or not someone or something is racist, we should try to examine those things and figure out why they're racist and what effect that racism has. As many of you are probably keenly aware, J.R.R. Tolkien's work, especially The Lord of the Rings, was and is the basis for much of the fantasy genre, and with it, the renowned RPG Dungeons & Dragons. As a matter of fact, Chainmail is just a fan homebrew that allowed Gygax and his friends to add elves and dwarves and wizards to wargaming. Even today, a majority of the settings from Faerun to Greyhawk to the old school Dragonlance are referred to as Tolkien-esque, and that's because Tolkien was the grandfather of fantasy tabletop role-playing games. With regard to someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, whose work is so influential, the question of his racism, whether intentional or not, is ultimately pointless. What we need to do is trace the origins of his work and figure out what legacy it's created. For example, here's how Tolkien described orcs and Uruk in his books. In the last years of Denethor I, the race of Uruks, black orcs of great strength, first appeared out of Mordor. The orcs are definitely stated as corruptions of the human form seen in elves and men. They are or were squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the two Europeans' least lovely Mongol types. While many have pointed to the fact that orcs are fictional, inhuman creatures who cannot be judged by the standards of human racism, they're still creatures largely created by Tolkien. I'd say largely because the man was a scholar. His work was based off of things like the Nordic Prose Eddas and Northern European mythology. In Tolkien's earliest Elvish dictionaries, for example, you can see the entry for orc, where it stands for words like monster, ogre, or demon. That in turn could have been a reference to the Latin orcus, which means a goblin or hell devil. It could also be from Orkneys and Beowulf, who are the tribes of creatures named alongside elves and ettins or giants that have been condemned by God. Regardless of its origins, Tolkien still chose to use as the basis for his description of monsters gross depictions and comparisons to actual East Asian people, often with black skin. He also went on to compare the dwarves, who were obsessed with gold and hoard treasure, to Semitic people, even using Semitic languages as the basis for Dwarvish. Once again, I'm not calling Tolkien a bigot. That's not the point. He was known for denouncing Nazi race doctrines and apartheid during his time, but that doesn't mean that his work doesn't suffer from racism and ethnocentrism. Tolkien's works repeatedly reinforce the misguided and problematic notions of conflating race, culture, and ability in fantasy settings. It was that racism, intentional or not, that brought the idea and term race into fantasy. Orcs are monstrous and barbaric, dwarves are obsessed with gold, and elves are a noble and magical race. And there's that word again, race. It's a word and concept that we can't escape even in our wildest imaginations. And what's worse is that in fantasy it's even stronger because it can hide behind the guise of referring to inhuman creatures. Honestly, that's something that I struggle with every day as a DM. It's not enough that as a person of color, I have to be so keenly aware of my existence as an other, that I am assumed to have certain hereditary traits, or that my survival can be determined on whether or not someone would see me as a demon, a monster with terrible resilience and incredible strength. Sadly, that was a description that Darren Wilson used in 2014 when he shot Michael Brown dead while he was unarmed. And that, my friends, is the foundation that our beloved game Dungeons & Dragons is built upon. 50 years of promoting ethnic essentialism behind the thin veil of goblins, orcs, and elves. What's worse is that those things aren't just conceptual. They're quantified with numerical values and are an essential component to the game. For example, this is what a half-orc is according to the game. Half-orcs get a +2 to strength and a +1 to constitution. Half-orcs mature a little faster than humans, reaching adulthood around the age of 14. Half-orcs are menacing and naturally intimidating. Half-orcs inherit a tendency towards chaos from their orc parents and are not strongly inclined towards good. Half-orcs raised among orcs and willing to live out their lives among them are usually evil. Of the other races, humans are the most likely to accept half-orcs, and half-orcs almost always live in human lands when not living among orc tribes. Whether proving themselves among rough human barbarian tribes or scrambling to survive in the slums of large cities, half-orcs get by in their physical might, their endurance, and their sheer determination that they inherit from their human ancestry. Now sure, I could assume with the most positive intent that this is merely fantasy with absolutely no grounding in reality. But let me ask you this. If I replaced the word orc with the word black and read out those exact same statements word for word, how racist do you think I would sound? The reason for this isn't just because those statements are offensive in and of themselves, but rather because they play off of the same stereotypes that have been used to describe black people for generations. For example, consider the myth of inherent athleticism, which not only minimizes the effort that black athletes put into their sports, but also dismisses them as a consequence of selective slave breeding.
And is Serena Williams' body the topic du jour once again?
These huge gluteal strength that contributes to Serena's wins. Jennifer
They quote, "It's frightening when you look at them, but really you just need to play against the ball."
Or the claims of advanced maturity in black children, which has led to harsher punishments, violence, sexualization, and even murder by authorities.
And seconds later,
Shots fired. Male down. Black male. Maybe 20. Black revolver. Black handgun.
Centoya Brown's case recently popped up on social media, and people are asking a lot of questions about the way it was handled. Brown is a black woman. She's also a victim of sex trafficking, and many wondered if those characteristics played into her sentence. Brown received a life sentence for killing a man when she was 16. She was tried as an adult.
Finally, there's the idea of living in the slums of larger cities, only to make it out due to an inherited determination from a mixed ancestry. These stereotypes are an underhanded way to perpetuate the marginalization of black people, and the apparent symmetry between them and the description of orcs, not only in the rule books, but also in the materials that inspire them, says a lot about the persistent power of representation. For those unfamiliar with representation theory, representation is how all media, print, games, movies, and TV deals with and presents things like gender, age, ethnicity, cultural identity, social issues, and events to an audience. It establishes that the meaning behind those things is contextualized by how they are presented in the media. So, for example, when films only cast people of color in stereotypical roles, then that carries over into our perceptions of people of color. This principle also holds true for imaginative fantasy like D&D. I could assume that the way that Dungeons & Dragons depicts orcs and other monstrous creatures is based purely on fantasy and has no origins on Eurocentric imperialist characterization of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. I could assume that they're just monsters, pure figments of imagination that satisfy a need for a monolithic antagonist. But why call them races when we know better? And why do so many gamers find the simple change in language and terminology so offensive to their experience? These may seem like ridiculous questions to a lot of you, and you may even ask yourself, why are you bringing race, politics, and political correctness into the game? The answer, my friends, is that I didn't bring politics into D&D. They were already there when race became the cornerstone of the game. As James Baldwin put it, it comes as a great psychological collision when you realize all these things you see are metaphors for your oppression and will lead into a kind of psychological warfare in which you may perish. And that's the kind of psychological warfare that a lot of us have been dealing with when playing the game. Now that we live in a world where it isn't so easy to ignore the experience of others, and where previously silenced voices can speak out, it behooves all of us to consider the ramifications of the game and the types of representation that it conveys. Unfortunately, Dungeons & Dragons has spent decades ignoring the experiences of people of color like myself. That's why so few of us play Dungeons & Dragons. It's not because we're less likely to be interested in high fantasy and science fiction. We are the highest growing market for those products. It's the reason why Black Panther, against all conventional wisdom, made $1 billion in the box office. We want to see ourselves in games, movies, TV, and books, especially our role-playing books. In fact, I started this channel with no money and little experience in content creation because I couldn't find other POC making this content. That's not to say that they aren't out there, because they are, but try to find a video series about being a Dungeon Master that's hosted by a person of color, and you'll see that there aren't nearly as many of us. And although there are a number of different reasons for this, I think it's primarily because the game materials have never really taken our experience into account. And although the game is based on imagination, the industry is based on fueling that imagination with content. They sell us books, and frankly, there haven't nearly been enough to feed our imagination. Now, I don't think that the writers over at Wizards of the Coast are being intentionally racist. They're just working with what they've been given for the past 50 years. A game system built on a foundation of imperialistic pseudoscience that can be traced back to antiquity and probably should have stayed there. The thing is, race isn't scientific. It's just a social construct hiding behind the pretenses of natural sciences. It's been employed throughout history as a means to establish an other and then confine that other to those stereotypes. More importantly, race has been used to dehumanize other people for millennia to justify cruelty, conquest, slavery, and apartheid. Even before whiteness existed as a concept, the Greeks and the Romans would often attribute monstrous characteristics to peoples based on their geography and access to water. In the history of white people, for example, Nell Painter shares some of the outlandish descriptions that Roman leaders and philosophers like Julius Caesar and Pliny the Elder recorded in their journals. Pliny's descriptions included Germanic cannibals, dog-faced men, tribes of Scythian cyclopses, and Albanians who could see better at night than they could in the daytime. These monstrous figures were such a prominent part of the early sciences that even Carolus Linnaeus, who invented the natural taxonomy systems that name plants and animals even today, had a section for monsters in his Systema Naturae. It's no wonder then that the concept of race developed in such a way to justify things like the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and the numerous genocides that have been committed throughout the ages. Thus, I believe that race, both as a term and a concept, is something that we should consider divorcing from fantasy role-playing altogether. Ultimately, it just seems to perpetuate a backward form of thinking that is unnecessary and toxic to gaming. Alternatively, if we did decide to keep the concept, we should treat it in a way that doesn't bear such an air of absolutism. It should be treated in the same way that we look at things like phrenology today, as outdated modalities that speak less to the truth and more to the biases of the individual authors. Or better yet, we should adopt systems like the brilliant Ancestry and Culture, which was penned by Arcanist Press. The supplement, which is available on DriveThruRPG, deconstructs the problematic races and provides us with an alternative that expands the possibilities of character creation rather than limiting it to stereotypes. As the authors put it in their introduction, this is not to say that there is no such thing as ancestry, heritage, or genetic difference, of course. Indeed, our genetics are real, but they are a function of individual ancestry and not race. What folks call racial differences simply do not map cleanly onto anything in our biology as simplistic as the concept of race. What's more, the concept in the real world has been used to justify historic atrocities. Indeed, racists still use these bogus faux scientific justifications to support their prejudice. Because these harmful concepts have no place in our world, they need not be in the stories that we tell our friends either. I suppose that even in fantasy, we can't escape the need for an other, a monster who, while not so dissimilar from us, can be easily killed without any hesitation because they're considered inhuman. It's a powerful thought. Unfortunately, it's not an original one, and it's one that's been played over in our history for ages. All that being said, I'm still a huge fan of D&D. The books in the 5th edition had clearly taken steps towards adding more gender and racial diversity into things like character art, which can go a long way for representation. As a long-term fantasy and RPG nerd of color, I can tell you that I've spent way too much time trying to find cool character art that still looked like me in some way. Still, after hundreds of publications, this was the first edition to take those experiences into consideration. I played other games throughout the years like GURPS and Shadowrun, and the flawed but excellent World of Darkness games from White Wolf, talking about 2nd and 3rd edition. Maybe it was a sense of nostalgia or the unique sense of being a hero. Like, I can still clearly remember the first time my friends Alberto and Andre brought over the red box to my apartment, and we played for something like 12 hours sharing a single set of dice. It was as though we had discovered this hidden treasure, right? Something from a bygone age that transported us to another world. And it was in that other world that I discovered myself and who I was. Playing D&D as a kid helped me through some of the toughest times in my young life. It taught me how to collaborate with others. It gave me the space to learn how to be a compassionate leader and a creative problem solver. That feeling of being myself and being the protagonist in the story was a deeply transformative experience that has marked me beyond measure. It's what keeps me playing. And I believe that it's something that we should all experience, that we should open the doors for as many players as possible because they deserve to feel like the hero. And isn't that why we play? So we can feel like heroes? Why can't we be heroes for everybody? So my friends, I ask you this. If all it takes to bring in more players, more experiences, and ultimately more joy to our tables is the omission of a backwards concept, then what the fuck is stopping us? I'm gonna open up the comments section, trusting that we can have a productive conversation about these things as opposed to being toxic. Really, all I'm trying to do is bring this game to more people. If you're with that, like I said, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me, especially as I start with my, I think I'm at double-digit subscribers right now. But yeah, I guess I'll catch you again in the workshop.